Good evening and welcome. I'm Michael Gillespie. I direct the Center for the Humanities and Urban Environment. And before introducing the speaker for tonight, Benjamin De La Pena, I would like to thank John Stewart and the Miami Beach Urban Studios for the hospitality, for the co-partnership and the cooperation of letting us use this beautiful venue. I'm very grateful to the tonight's speaker, Benjamin De La Pena of the Knight Foundation, who was participant in May of a very interesting panel discussion on the design district and the direction that was going. And based on that, we asked him if he would elaborate some of his ideas and incorporate them into a longer talk. The talk tonight is the Barton Memorial Lecture, and it is a gift of Professor Jose Gabilondo of the law school, and the lectures are loosely based on the idea of the relationship between law and the economy, and I think that probably the impact of urban development and especially urban transportation is very relevant to both the law and the economy, especially the way we drive and spend in Miami. It's a great pleasure to introduce Benjamin De La Pena. Please join me in welcoming him.
There you go. And so this is just one of those things that they need to make us useful. I am glad this is really intimate, so I don't have to formally look at this. So there you go, green. I'm colorblind, by the way, so I actually thought that was orange. No, I knew it was off one color or the other. Before I start, I'm gonna give you this very short video. That is, if I can find the. All right.
I can see it here on the dash, and red light. But that was interesting. He got a really bad taxi really well, which is incredible. And oh my gosh, this is so. I'm not touching it at all, and it's driving. Whoa, the lanes are getting a little. Oh no, there it goes, and it stops. I mean, being here in a Tesla Model S P90T with ludicrous mode, which is incredibly fun, but the fact that it can do all of this stuff, and you can see on here the vehicle in front of you that's following, and you can see where that is in its lane, and you can see all of the sensors going back and forth on the dashboard display here. Oh my gosh, it's changing lanes on its own. Oh my gosh, it's changing lanes on its own. That is wild. So I hit the brakes there, but I didn't think I need to. I think that was me getting nervous, and the car didn't have a problem. The car was like, just watch out, there's something in front, but it was slowing down on its own. That's weird that I started freaking out before the car did.
That's a Model S that has been in the market for a while. The self-driving properties came through a software update that just came through this week. So technology is in the market, and it was just a software update. So the title is, Why Will My Robot Car Need Your Parking Podium? And I understand that the idea of a parking podium may be alien to some. This is kind of a Hong Kong term, right? The parking podium is where the stack of parking on which the rest of the building sits. So you see it all over Miami. It's like 12 to 13 stories of parking, and then they have the amenities deck on top of it, and then they have the towers coming up, right? So that's a parking podium, and they do it in malls too. And the question I want to explore with you guys today is, if we get robot cars, will we need parking podiums? But I'm going to take you back first before we go look at the implications. Right? So first we examine horse manure. This was a headline in New York Times around 1881. Right? So there's no place to dump stable manure. What is to become of it? Because mode of transportation in all the major cities, including New York and London, which at the time were the megacities, at about 3 million each, was horses, right? And place was crowded with carriages. Right? Kind of romantic way, you can get around and you smell the horse, but it was a little more intense than that. They had 150,000 horses in New York City. At the turn of the century, that was 3 million pounds of horse manure per day. Right? Talk about pollution. And then 40,000 gallons of horse urine that you had to deal with. So this is what it looked like. Piles and piles. You would just shovel it to the side. There's lots of ways to make money. There are people who would clear a pathway for you if you wanted to cross. You'd pay them a few cents or so on the road. And of course, this smelled horrible and it attracted flies. Remember also, this was a time when there would be cholera and typhoid running through the city. They also had dead horses. So it's like, the horse dies, you just leave it there. Maybe someone will clear it. So horrible places, cities at that time. Biggest problem of transportation, pollution was horse manure. In fact, they predicted if it continued on, right, that in London, the city would be buried 9 feet deep in horse manure by 1950. This was in 1894. And in New York, they said by 1930, the horse droppings would rise to Manhattan's 3rd-story windows. That's how much. They tried to make money of it. There were a couple of boroughs that said, we'll sell it to the rural areas for fertilizer. Their big problem was the logistics of carrying it and dumping it out. And then because there was so much of it, the price was really low. So was it worth it to pay for the labor to bring it out to the rural areas, right? So the savior around the turn of the century, 1895, the savior of the city comes around, although it wasn't regarded as such, right? The horseless carriage. With the first internal combustion. Some of the first cars were actually electric. And the internal combustion engine. And it was great. It looked like a horseless carriage. And the benefits were, you don't get horse manure and you don't get urine. You also don't get the driver, you get a driver for the car, right? So this was 1895. And of course, by the first decade, then you had Ford and the Model T and the assembly line and all of these newfangled management technology, right? That got them to produce the Ford Model T at its lowest price was $295 a year, which was affordable to people who worked in Ford. So Henry Ford was pretty smart. He was making these things and he had the market. As a result, this is what happened to car sales. So 300 by 1895, this is just in the US, right? And by the 1930s, about 23 million cars. And lots of handsome and cab drivers and stables lost money. Right? But they didn't have any more manure in the streets, though. Well, that was pretty good. Okay. Then the next problem became traffic congestion. Mainly from people trying to find parking, because the only kind of parking you could have was on the sides of the streets, right? Curbside parking. And this is Pittsburgh. This is Detroit in the 1930s. Right? So it gets pretty crowded. There were not very clear road rules just yet, but a whole lot of cars. So our cities were scrambling to figure out, what do you do with the cars? How do you manage them? It had picked up some of the technology of managing this from the age of the carriages. They had the stoplights. We already had that. And so all of this was growing rapidly as the cities were also growing. Now, while all of this was happening, the poverty in the cities, the horse manure, the new cars, there were all these ideas of having to solve and reorganize cities, right, which started happening. In the 1600s or so, we would map cities, and we would design parts of it, usually the civic parts. But the idea of reorganizing and shaping a whole city didn't start coming around till around the Industrial Revolution, of this idea of what is the perfect city and how would you reorganize the city. And there are several thought leaders. I'm going to mention a couple. This is Ebenezer Howard in 1902. He said the cities of tomorrow would be gardens. And what you would do was there would be a central city, that's where you're going to work, and people would go out and they would live in these garden areas. You would have an acre of land to yourself or a backyard of some sort, and you would just travel back and forth by train or something else. And that eventually guided the thinking around suburbia. That you lived and you separated from where you work. Remember again that cities at this time were kind of very noxious places. Apart from the Horseshoe Ring, you had abattoirs. Chicago was a big abattoir. Chicago River burned twice, right? Because there was just a lot of offal in it. So the idea of both separating uses and separating away from where you work just started to get hold. Remember also at this time, they still called it the germ theory of disease transmission. The idea of germs wasn't around yet. It was the idea that there was bad air and malaria, right? And it was the bad air that would get you sick, so you need to be away. And then a couple of the modernists, right? The modernist architecture. This is Le Corbusier's radiant city plan for parts of Paris, or a prescription for any city. And he had visited actually Henry Ford's factory and saw the efficiency of the assembly line. And so he's imagining cities need to be like this. We'll live in these tall buildings, and then we'll have avenues of corridors of transportation, and then you'd separate out everything else, right? So it becomes efficient. And the goal was to have efficient cities, because look at how machines are efficient. In fact, he called the house a machine for living, and expand that to cities are machines that you needed to manage. Right? This is again Radiant City. His plan for Le Marais, which is an older part of it was the aristocratic part of Paris, but at some point in the turn of the century, it wasn't very aristocratic anymore. And he said, clear out that whole thing. We'll put up these tall towers. There's highways. This will be all more efficient. Right? And I'm glad he didn't get to do that, because Le Marais now is just one of the nicest parts of Paris. Okay. Frank Lloyd Wright, also another thinker at the time, said, these are horrible cities. What we need to do is we need to move people away from each other. Everyone gets an acre. And then the city will disappear. And he invented these little helicopters that you would travel by, and the only thing standing would be these towers, right? That were like, I think, control towers or so, but you would live apart from everyone else. So there's a lot of thinking going on about what was the city for, how was it going to work, and then at the base of it was this idea of you can make a city more efficient, you can separate things out, and then the whole thing will work better, because it was a mess. So that culminated in 1933 with the Siam. I'm going to pronounce it badly, and John could probably help us. The Congress International Modern, the modernists, right, who said, what we need to do is to analyze the city and program it and separate the uses, and this was their Atlas of the Functional City. They they created the Athens Charter. Part of it was they were on a boat just talking about how would we reshape cities, and those ideas have shaped a lot of what we see today. Central to that idea was transportation corridors and highways. While this was happening too, and I think I just realized I missed the slide. So part of it was the separation of uses. Yellow is residential, red was commercial, all these kinds of uses, and you will see this standard in a lot of city plans now. Right? We say, this is where you live and that is where you work. Now understand that the previous 5,000 years of city building, we didn't quite do that, unless you were royal, where you had your palace and you had your summer home. Everyone kind of worked in the city. You were a baker, you lived above where you worked with your bakery. This was, we need to make it more efficient, we need to separate it. Around the same time, and I'm not going to have slides because I just realized I didn't put in those slides, was that we started building roadways and better highways. Okay. while this was happening too, and sorry that this is not sequential, but here are the layers of thought around it, right? So I told you that cities were messy, and we need to separate the noxious uses from acceptable uses. And cities had decided that the way to do that was to do functional zoning. Only particular functions allowed were in particular places. And the high watermark was a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court about the village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Corporation. Euclid is a small town in Ohio. The Ambler Realty had about 58 acres just outside the town. Town said, we're going to zone it. You can only build residential on it. Ambler said, wait a minute, that's a violation. It's unconstitutional. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is a valid use, valid expression of the police power of the state, right, that you can use that. So the term Euclidean zoning comes from this court case. It's not about the geometry of things. And that basically, from then, and again, more example of what it looks like. If I remember when I was in grad school, I was a planner, and we were working alongside architects and landscape architects and urban designers. The architects kept telling us that we had bad colors. We had bad color tastes, and they didn't realize that, no, those are land use codes. You have to use them. Because for a planner, if you see yellow, you know that's all residential. Red is commercial, blue is institutional. You separate out those uses. This was the imagination of what a good city is. Right. So alongside those zoning requirements, those zoning laws, there started to emerge kind of parking requirements. Remember, the problem was they had so many cars, there was no parking. So some cities started off with Colombo saying, no, we need to require parking. If you're going to build a new building, we're going to require you to provide parking off the street. And by 1949, 185 cities had minimum parking requirements attached to particular zones, because this got all systematized. And we've carried that on until now. Here's kind of the average. So for every residential, in residential areas, for every dwelling unit, for every house that you have or apartment, you need 1.5 parking spaces, right, on average. Commercial, 3 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. So that multiplies up. If you have 100,000 square feet, then you have 300 parking spaces or so. And office was about 2 to 2.5. And this just got adopted. And I'll tell you, the logic behind it and why people are starting to question it. So this, again, this is not a linear presentation. While all this was going on, of course, this is America. If there's a way to make money off something, they're going to make money off something. Not only were there new parking requirements, there was a lot of demand for parking. So there was a lot of creativity and invention going on to how do we store these two-ton vehicles. Back then, they were a little lighter. They were a ton, 2-ton vehicles. And they've invented things like the split platform parking lot, right, where you would have a ramp up and down, and it would be easy to then drive up. Right? They also had big towers. This is in New York City that this eventually got converted back into an actual hotel, but it operated as this kind of a car hotel for a long time that had elevators and machines that would pull up your car all the way up so you could store it. So parking buildings exploded, and the companies that own this, so here's another one, parking. This used to be a hotel in Minneapolis. The owners, Griffith and the Griffith family, realized that there was going to be more money to be had from creating a parking lot than actually running the hotel. They tore it down and became the Denison Garage. The Denison parking company is still around and is one of the biggest parking companies around the world now because it's making a lot of money. In fact, these are the 2 big industries now, the organizations internationally. Here's the National Parking Association internationally. It's International Parking Institute. They publish things like the parking professional, right? That tells, guides parking professionals on their careers. They also put out emerging trends on parking. Here's the number. So they predicted I think this number is from 2013, and total parking demand was 22.25 billion by 2015. and this is just in the US. Big money. Big money on very cheap land. Minimum development. They are a political force. In New York City, when Mayor Bloomberg tried to do congestion pricing, the big pushback was from parking lot owners. Right? And nearly every transportation conversation, the parking lot owners are there, because this is big money. All right. Fast forward, 2014, we got 1.2 billion motor vehicles. So in a little more than a century, from 300 cars to 1.2 billion motor vehicles, and it's predicted that it'll hit 2 billion by the end of this decade, because the demand is really growing. So let me bring it down to downtown Miami, and then at the end of this presentation, we can chat a bit. What does this mean, all of this parking requirement, right? The parking requirements in Miami are so that zoning ordinance was the old ordinance, Miami 21 is the new one. It got into effect, was it 2014? Right, so Miami 21. And it doesn't vary much from the standards that you saw nationally, right? In fact, it went up in the central business district. It's 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Office is about 1 space per 1,000 square feet. And then that's what you get for residential, 1.5. Miami 21 does have some exceptions for residential. If you're you're near a transit node that where you have transit service that goes between 10 to 15 minutes headway, that's mean space between the trains from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., then you can go without parking. And I think only 2 buildings so far have actually availed of it. But the rest tend to want to do this kind of parking requirement. Physically, what does that mean? It's almost in downtown, because I needed to narrow this geographically where I could get data. It's about 50,000 parking spaces. 19 are surface, and about 27 are structured parking spaces. Valet spaces, I couldn't get much more data on that than that number. What does that translate to? So in downtown, the residential population is 80,000, and the daytime population, all of the workers who come in, is 220,000. So in the nighttime, it's 1 parking space for every 2 people. And in the daytime, it's 1 parking space for every 4 people. Would sound efficient, right? If all those 4 would ride a car together. But you always get complaints about not enough parking in downtown. Physically, what does that mean? Well, you get the parking lots like this. And the other thing we like to do, parking lots and parking structures are not pretty. Right? They're kind of dead looking, but we put a lot of young architects to decorating these things. Right? So we either paint them. This is the I think Department of Transportation, or we put actual decorations in the fenestration. This is at the Intercon. This is my parking building. Pattern to it. This is I think 20 stories of parking. 20 stories of office parking. Really? These are all passed, right?
Yeah, they're all passed. Yeah,
But you still have to come up with the parking.
Not have the exposed wall like you have
Right.
with the parking exposed, and there are certain implications for that.
So this is allowed.
Not supposed to be allowed under Miami 21. That's the end of the old code.
It could be. Right. These are my favorite ones. They're in axis. So
That's allowed.
they have nice terraces for the cars. The cars never come out to watch, but it's all glass. But in there is all just cars, and it's I think 8 stories or so of it, of cars with windows to watch out. Is that what it is? They need to have a view.
You have to buffer the parking. The parking has to be hidden behind a wall of residential. You're supposed to be residential.
Oh, you're supposed to have a curtain of residential around it.
Yes, exactly. So
Right.
the street is activated by residential.
Okay.
Not deadened by the wall of parking, but there are other implications to that.
Right. Okay. Let's see how that goes. So let's do some math on this one of what it means, 50,000 square feet. If you do structured parking, if you include all of the lanes that the cars have to, and the ramps that the cars need to be able to get to the parking space, it's about 323 square feet per car. So, okay, this is that 50,000 square feet times 162 square feet. Total area is about 8.1 million square feet, if that was all surface parking. 8.1 million square feet. If we took the structured parking, it alone, 27,000 spaces, right? It's about 8.718, nearly 9 million square feet. Again, this includes the ramps and the lanes. What does that translate to? So the structured parking of 4.7, why did I get to 4.7 here? Right, all right, is about 15,000 or nearly 16,000 one-bedroom units at 550 square feet. So that, if you, the equivalent of that is 15,000 one-bedroom units that we're spending on parking. The average cost, about 30,000 for structured parking. So all of that structured parking is about $810 million, right, that we built. Which, by the way, in Miami and in Miami 21, it didn't do this. In some zoning, what they require is that you unbundle the cost of parking, so that if I'm buying a condo, I would have to buy the parking separately, and that it makes it more expensive for the buyer because then you have to buy a parking lot or parking space, but it makes it cheaper for everyone else because I'm not paying for everyone else's parking space. And in Miami, it hasn't been unbundled. It's big business for the state too, not just for the buildings, right? This is Miami Parking Authority, the mother lode, and they operate 31,000 parking spaces. All of this brings in, and this was 2014 data, $30 million to the coffers of Miami-Dade. I'm sorry, no, this is Miami Parking. The city? No, it's the county. So Miami-Dade. Most of it from on-street revenue and also from parking lot. They also service the buildings. So it's big money also for the city. This is revenue, not taxes, right? Here's the thing, though. You go back to those numbers, and this is I highly recommend, if you're a geek about transportation, to read Donald Shoup's The High Cost of Free Parking. There's a whole bunch of people around the world called Shoupistas who are big fans of Donald Shoup and really look at the economics of parking. So he basically says that all of that parking gets paid for one way or the other in both the development and in what you buy, right? So we've managed to require parking spaces for a lot of commercial development, and that's why you will see around malls C's and C's of parking. Those are required per building development, and it's spec so that it's the maximum load on the heaviest shopping day of the year, which is Black Friday. Right? So all of those parking is spec for that. Most of the time, only 40% of the parking lot is actually used. I think Shoup has this number that every car in the US has 3 parking spaces available to it in total. That's the ratio. Because we have required parking more than the market actually demands. So, and in fact, they like saying you scratch someone who's protesting about parking, behind them they're communist about parking. They can be completely capitalist, but they're communist about parking because I'm going to lose my parking space. So all of that he did a lot of research on it, and he said we don't really know where it came from. There's no study that said this is how much parking is needed. Okay, now for the main event, and this will be a little shorter. What does it mean, enter the robot car? You saw the Tesla, and a whole bunch of companies are actually moving into this space, non-traditional auto companies, that the auto companies themselves are scared of what's going on. This was from the 1950s. I think this was Popular Science. And if you notice, what are they doing? They're playing Scrabble, because you don't have to drive. You also notice that it's suburban. Right? You're driving long distances. You don't have to do this chore anymore. This was the vision in the 1950s. And the robot car, the self-driving car, actually started coming around in the 1970s. But the technology has only really matured around this time. And National Highway Transportation Safety Authority, is that an authority or administration, has classifies what a robot car can do in 4 levels, right? The first one is function specific. Can it park itself? It's a particular function. Can it parallel park or whatever else? And then all the way to level 4, which is what you saw in the Tesla, it is fully self-driving. So the space is getting crowded. I'm sure you've heard of Google's robot car. This is what they plan to produce. They intentionally made it look happy and non-threatening. And it only travels 25 miles per hour. Right? So it's a slow speed. There is no steering wheel on that thing. You get on it, and you tell it where to go, maybe through Google. Maybe you'll talk to it and say, hey, Google, take me to, and it'll take you there. And they're actually working on manufacturing that thing. Here's Mercedes' vision of it, and they've been doing a lot of guidance work for the past 30 years or so. And what's interesting about it, if you notice, again, the idea of you would be doing other things. I think it's a business meeting inside this thing. Because you didn't have to drive. And so part of the promise is they're giving you back the 50 minutes or so on average that you commute, that you would be driving, you'd be doing something else. Of course, for me, it's like, well, let me walk to where I'm going and I'm done in 10 minutes or 15 rather than riding this thing. Here's a safety dividend, they said, and this is what Google presses its, why they're developing the robot car, right? 90 to 95% of car crashes are due to human error. If you can eliminate that, then you will then eliminate a lot of fatalities and injuries, as they promise. Here's the implication just on level 1, right? If you have function-specific automation, which we already have, you have cars that can parallel park. You also have cars that can park, head in. Right? And so if you took, supposedly it'll save as much as a third of the space that you now dedicate to parking. So if we took the same numbers from downtown, we could get 5,000 one-bedroom units that currently we devote to parking right now, structured parking, if it reduces it by 1 space. Of course, these are all theoretical numbers, right? But it just tells you how much urban space we devote to the storage of these vehicles. At level 4, they say it'll reduce parking demand by 75%, if you even need to park this thing, because it can move around, right? And so that would mean 11,000, nearly 12,000 one-bedroom units that you could carve out of these places. In fact, there are a number of exercises I've seen in architecture schools where they think about how are you going to repurpose these parking spaces. And they make for nice charrettes. Did you have one?
That's the biggest problem with Miami 21 is that it doesn't allow you to repurpose it with windows or any kind of exposure flow.
Right.
To the outside.
Because you're inside.
Right. It forces you to be an enclosed box, so you can't repurpose it to office or you can't repurpose it to residential or something like that.
Right. Warehouse
I
space.
thought a fair amount about this.
Right. Right.
So
Okay.
I'm nerding out.
Okay. Here's the other big thing, though. It will reduce ownership. And this was a very recent study by Sivak and Shettle from University of Michigan, right? From ownership rates by 43%. So on average, households in the US own 2.1 cars. But that's going, according to their study, it'll go down to 1.2. And this has car manufacturers nervous, right? Because it's already been trending down. I think it went up again this year. The car sales have gone up slightly, but if this happens, then that means that they'll be selling less cars.
Why would that ever happen?
Well, here's the next number.
I have 2 cars, I want another, If it's an automated car, I want one for my kid.
Well, here's what you would do, right?
So I'd have 3 cars.
Your automated car, it's 2 things. One, it's the shift from ownership to usership, right? So Uber has not hid the fact that it wants to do robot cars too. In fact, they pirated all of Carnegie Mellon's robotics department so that they'll develop their robot cars. So you could then have an Uber that will come pick you up, which means you don't have to own this thing. It's a service. Right? The other is if you do own it, you can just order it back. So say it brings you to the office, you tell it, go back, pick up the kids.
Right, which is what I would do, because I want it to be my car. I want it to represent and brand me.
You could be, yeah.
I want, like the car cars have done for the last 100 years.
As your personality,
As my
right?
personality.
Right.
Shows how wealthy I am. It shows how
Right. Right.
my
Right.
preferences.
Right.
It's a suit.
Yeah. It may be your generation.
I'm telling you, I'm not alone. I'm not alone.
That's
And
it's
look
true.
at- Look at
But-
Ken's.
but-
I mean, a friend of mine is the chief designer for Nissan,
Yeah.
and that's what he does. He basically talks to kids and says, kids who can't drive yet,
Right.
and says, what are you going to want to drive?
That's the other thing, right? So the interesting thing about this is it's going to drop ownership because maybe you can just use it as a service, or it'll do double things, right? The other thing is it's actually going to increase usage. So in that scenario, for instance, rather than you driving to the office and leaving the car there, you send it back. Or, as Robin Chase, who is the founder of Zipcar, likes to say, right? What if you own this thing, you'll say, oh, wait for me, drive around the block. I'm just going to go get my dry cleaning. It'll just be 10 minutes. And this thing will be driving around the block. Also, that people like your kids or your grandparents who are now not legally allowed to drive can get into one of these robot cars and drive where they want to go, right? I'm sorry? You can drink and drive, right? You can also ultra commute, right? Say you live 4 hours away, so you go sleep in the car and wake up where you want to work. Who knows? Who knows where this is all going, right? But it has, in the same way that the way we required the increase of the horseless carriage and the way we required spaces for it reshaped our cities, this is going to reshape our cities. Okay, this is what Robin Chase likes to say, beware of the zero occupancy vehicle. He says if you hate, and transportation planners and planners hate single occupancy vehicles because basically you're eating up a lot of space, of about 30 square feet per car or 30 square meters per car. Zero occupancy vehicles, you have that. Just go back, go pick it up, go around the block, particularly if it's an ownership model. All right, winding up, where are we in technology? This is Komatsu's robot trucks. These are huge trucks. A person is only about yay tall in these things. These serves Rio Tinto mining, Rio Tinto's mines in Australia and in Canada. They're huge trucks, and it's long trips, and it's very expensive to pay a driver, and they realize there's nothing it's going to bump into anyway. We can have them automated, and they do. They're doing that now. Closer to home, this is the Freightliner that Mercedes-Benz has developed. Right? It's a freight truck. It's a semi, right? And it's now legal in Nevada. They're testing it in Nevada. And if you see the guy who's still a driver, he's not really driving. He's reading a newspaper. So they're testing that already in Nevada. And here's the savings. Here's the logic for it. On average, long-haul drivers get paid about $40,000 a year. Right? So the logic of removing that and putting in a robot, they're still now requiring that there's some human be there, but realistically, you don't need the human, especially if they don't have to go into a city, if they just go to distribution centers, right? This is Florida. Nope. Oh, it's a little stretched. Give me one moment. I'm going to adjust that thing. And I'm going to show it to you. And it's going to be loud. Got stretched. All right. This is legal as of this year in South Florida's roads. Can't control it. Forgive the royal music. Truck-mounted attenuator. That's what a TMA is. It's there's a lead car, but it's completely automated. A truck-mounted attenuator, you need it for construction. What it is, it's a buffer. At the same time, it puts things like puts the pylons down, right? So it's legal now for highway construction in Florida. So you haven't seen them, maybe you haven't noticed them. Right?
No, I have
You've seen them?
I have
Wow.
seen that. I didn't notice whether it was being driven by a push car. I've seen one
Yep.
just like that.
Right. So, which is the last thought I'm going to leave you with, right? That this is, well, not the last thought, but here's a couple of other things to think about as far as robot cars go. We talked about parking revenues. This is $30 million for the city or the county every year. There's speeding fines. If they're robots, they're not going to speed, right, unless you take control of it. So all of the revenue from speeding is going to go. There's sales taxes if we're shifting to ownership or to usership versus ownership. That's going to drop. Liability and insurance, the question of, so if I'm riding the robot car and it bumps you, am I responsible? Or is it if it's a service, then maybe they're responsible? How does that all work? Truck stop economies, and this is a really good article on how robot cars are going to hit us like a human driving a truck. That the $40,000 income of usually of a truck driver, they live in small towns in truck stops. If it's a robot car, it doesn't have to stop. Right? And then apart from losing that job, you lose all of the asset. Probably would need gas, but it probably could give itself gas.
Maybe a reboot.
Yeah. Or if it's electric,
What if the computer needs to be restarted?
there you go. Like press the stop button. Then you have repair people coming around, right? It'll be a drone. It'll be a drone that'll come over and start it. And then lastly, here's a really interesting thing: organ donations. So it's something like 80% of organ donors come from car crash accidents or car crashes, right? If there's no more car crashes, where will you get organ donations? So just some of the strange thoughts around this. I think what I want to leave you with is the impression that the transportation system that we're going to get in 5 to 10 years is not your grandfather's transportation system. It's going to be very, very different. Very, very different.
And what about public transportation? Like, I can simply have an electric car come pick me up. Would I ever take the L bus down here from?
Well,
North
there's a
City?
lot of so historically the adoption of the horseless carriage started with fleets. Right? So the first ones to adopt it were the police, because they had lots of stables. So to shift to horseless carriage made sense because they didn't have to feed all the horses and they had to clear the stables. So the fleet pickup is going to be first. So you've got the trucks. San Francisco, not San Francisco itself, one of the Bay Area cities, is testing driverless bus, so it's China. Then you've got all of the app-based driven services, right? So you've got, in Uber, you've got Uber Pool, where you can share a ride. Lyft has Lyft, is it Lyft Rides or Lyft? I'm forgetting what their shared ride is. Then there's Bridge in Massachusetts, which is basically bus service, but with an app, and they optimize where things are going based on a lot of data. There's Split in DC, and Split is like Uber Pool, except that rather than going to where you are, they'll tell you where you need to wait for the bus and guarantee that within 5 minutes the shared ride is going to come. So there's a lot more of that coming
New York
around.
City is Via.
New York City is Via. The
Right.
taxi companies are trying to adapt with Arrow. So there's a lot of disruption going on in the space. And for transportation agencies, actually, the challenge is this. They've been used to being operators and managers of transportation, or operators mainly. And if it's becoming more of an information game, because all of this, the robot car itself, is all about information. If it's becoming more an information game, how should you manage the transportation system if you were going to manage it as information? So that's, I think, a very interesting implication. So that's it. And let's do Q&A. Yep.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. This is very interesting. I was wondering if you could clarify, the reason that we don't need as many parking spaces with self-driving cars is because they would be going back.
They don't have to park.
You don't need to leave them anywhere. They can either go around or go back.
If it's a usership model, then an ownership model, right? It'll be like the Uber. It'll go around, look for its
Yeah.
next customer.
Okay.
Or
But if you own it,
you could send it back.
you send it back. So then
You
instead
send
of
it
paying for parking, you're paying for gas or whatever, or
Right.
electricity.
Right.
But so the money is the same, but the space is what's saved. That's
The
what
space
we're talking
is
about.
what's saved, yes.
That could
The
then
money
be used
could
for
be the
something
same,
else.
yes.
Okay.
But here's that big tension, right? And I know John says that he still wants a car that he can own and call his own. There really is a big tradition of shifting to, particularly among millennials who are not buying cars. They're not buying cars. They're not even, the 18-year-olds are not applying for driver's licenses. I think it's only 50%, 54% of that generation, the 18 to 24-year-olds have applied for 16 to 24-year-olds have applied for driver's licenses. That used to be in the high 80s and the 90s, right? Because they don't want to drive cars anymore. The use of public transit is up, biking is up, and walking is up. So it all shifts on whether are we going to see the car as something you own, or you're going to see it as a service. If it's a service, even more so, you're not going to need parking because it's just going to go around. Of course, at some time at the night when no one else is using it, it's going to need some sort of parking somewhere. But when you own a car, basically for 18 hours a day, it's not doing anything.
Yeah.
It's sitting in a parking lot.
Right. I think maybe if it's self-driving, I think people will want to own it because you're not really going to take a nap with a bunch of other strangers if it's just a user thing. You're going to want to have your own thing where you're sleeping on the ride, right? I don't see people napping on buses.
I don't know how behavior will shift, right? We
Yeah.
don't know how behavior will shift.
Yeah,
Well, people
I
sleep on
share your
planes.
feeling. I share her. It's highly speculative. A lot of this not ownership change of, not only are you changing the way an industry functions as far as the driverless, but it's a whole mind shift that
Yeah.
people are not going to want to own a car.
Well,
I mean, I would rather not own a car. Believe me, it's like
Right.
I would want to ride public transportation, the L bus, if it were efficient. The
If it
ownership,
were efficient.
yeah, the ownership of a car, it's actually cumbersome to me.
yeah.
It's like the
Yeah,
simple.
but don't you love that, like, that sense that
The
you
new
put
cars-
your music on, and you can put your, you've got everything laid out just the way you want it in there, it's clean and tidy.
No,
What?
I listen to music at the concert hall, and the car is just going from point A to
Isn't the
point
car
B.
your Zen place? I mean, so many people find mindfulness in their car. Like, that's the only place. You're not on your phone, you're hopefully not texting, you're listening, you're in your space, you're in your zone. That's where you get your energy.
There's a strong correlation between the amount of time you spend driving and mental health.
And it's not correlated the way I'm.
The more time you spend in the car, with you work.
I don't drive. I live and work on Miami Beach, so I'm on 10th Street and 171st Street, hence the L. But
traffic.
or what we say is
Traffic
what
gets
the
people
L.
crazy. Like
It
being
makes
stuck
me
in
crazy,
traffic
yeah.
for hours.
Yeah, but don't you like put on something like really amazing, like Philip Glass's like Etudes, and you're just like, wow.
Not in the car.
No, you guys can't show.
If you're going on a highway and you have a clear space in front of you, yeah.
Cell phone rings through Bluetooth.
I know. Well, yeah, getting a good conversation with your mom. No better place than the car. Are you kidding?
Yeah, which you can do that with a robot car. You don't even have to pay. You don't
I know.
pay attention to
I know
that.
you can definitely. Unless it's not, yeah, and you can do that even if it's not yours. And I'm sure those cars are going to be like a rental car. Like you get a nice rental car, and you go in, and it's just like that every time.
Google is definitely designing it to be a service. And then you get BMW and Mercedes all shifting towards what would we do if this was a service. So
Right.
Ford invested in Zipcar, Mercedes has Car2Go,
Mhm.
BMW has a different service, I think in Europe, I don't know what the service is here. But they're all trying to figure out if that happens, Toyota started calling itself a mobility company, not a car company.
The
What are
car's
the
driving
projected
around.
prices of the self-driving vehicle?
I'm sorry?
The projected prices, we all fly, but none of us own airplanes.
Right.
And
Right.
is the idea that they will be prohibitively expensive, and so we will become users rather than owners?
The Tesla is at what, 60? Is it the S is 60,000?
Oh, the S is well, you can't really get out of there for less than 130.
130.
Yeah.
There you go. They're targeting.
One of your board members, but there's a
They're
lower
targeting. Yeah,
version of it.
they're targeting
It's
at.
80, I think.
Yeah, they're targeting at, and he's targeting down market. I think he's targeting at 30,000.
No, if Hertz had those to rent, I would rent, and I was in a city I didn't know, like I just came back from Chicago, I would totally rent a driverless Hertz car, like a Tesla. I couldn't afford a Tesla, but whatever, the VW, since they're probably gonna need a makeover soon. So yeah, whatever.
So it's expensive now, but one thing we know about technology is the prices drop eventually. So it could be, and again, the two sides to it, right? Is it that it's so expensive you can't afford to buy the car, and so they're going to shift to a service model, because then there'll be a shared, you're paying more for this, and they'll get more use out of it. Who knows?
I saw a model a couple of years ago. I think they already have this, maybe in China, where the buses kind of have a shape like a bridge, and so cars can go, around cars.
Yeah, no, that was an idea of how to
Oh,
get
did
buses.
that happen?
That's a really dumb idea.
No, okay. Well, I read about this.
One is
it's like to share the road
it's
because
this
they're over
elevated
them.
bus,
Yeah.
right, that
Well, like
rides
a
astride the
bridge.
cars.
Yeah.
The
Like a
a
drive
transportation geek, that's a really dumb idea, because again,
Okay.
you're just privileging cars. Second, is you
Oh.
can't turn that thing. So all that thing does is just this, or maybe it'll turn really, really slowly this way, and then you run over
Okay.
the car.
Well, the other thing I was wondering is, why are we thinking in 3D? Like, aren't they thinking of making things float now and hover, and in which case the road is no longer.
So a really big edge of exploration, and you see it from Amazon, right, is drone deliveries.
Right.
Because those drones can now carry 2-pound packages. And the economics of, do you have a car that you stop with 30 or 40 or 100 of these, and then it has to go around, the van has to go around delivering it, or do you do point to point with a drone, a UAV, that'll then deliver it and then come back?
But then how do you manage traffic in
You
the
just have to
area?
figure out. So there's proposals of zones, right? There's the high-speed aerial zone at 300 feet and a slow-speeder aerial zone at about 100 to 200 feet. And then they're trying to figure out, how do you deliver it? Where does it land? Then the whole licensing thing. How do you know this is the right UAV? And we can pick up from things we've done before, like the licensing of vehicles, to figure out UAVs. I don't know if the economics of it is working out. Does 10 or 100 drones to deliver 100 or 50 of those 2-pound things work out better than a white van and a driver? Probably much more efficient time-wise.
Actually, there's a company working on the company that has a parcel truck that has a roof that opens up and has a delivery drone. The driver has a touch screen. He presses on the touch screen, and he loads the package onto the drone that takes off, and then goes to the location, drops the package off, and returns back to the truck. And he can deliver the package, another package, while this is happening. So, and as a matter of fact, they're working on driverless buses in China right now also. So,
They're testing it right now.
yeah.
I think it would first come out in public transit, the driverless fleets, because that's the most expensive thing again in transit. The unions are not going to be happy with it.
The bus, what are the Teamsters, where are they following us? What are they doing about it? Anything?
I don't know if they're doing anything on it.
I mean, because it's basically eliminate, the Teamsters union, which is founded in the bus and transportation.
Right.
Well, I wonder how many long-haul truckers are still union.
I think a lot of them still are. I think
Really?
some of the big unions, the union strength comes from those particular industries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're seeing that even in South Florida, the division between like Monroe County and Broward County on the Uber question.
Right.
Whereas Miami-Dade is pro-Uber, the other two are not, so.
Or at least Miami-Dade is kind of neutral on, we're not making a decision yet.
Right. It was interesting, I was recently in Amsterdam and they allow, I was wondering why all these Tesla cabs were picking people up at the airport, and it's because they had originally allowed only Tesla to pick people up at the airport. But then they realized that many people fly into airports in Europe and the United States, and they're looking for 6-hour. They're flying into Amsterdam, but they want to go to Venice, and they want to drive there. They literally ask the taxi to drive them there, and taxis do that. But a Tesla won't stay powered for that long, and so they weren't able to accommodate all their customers. So they went back to offering special accommodations. You can go back to the airport as much as you want without the 8-hour required break in a Tesla. So you can share a Tesla, you can pay it off much faster than a regular car. So, but with the elimination of the human factor in driving, it's going to be, I mean, even Uber drivers are going to be
Which-
challenged to think about what they will do and what the new industries for them will be.
Which is interesting, right? Because Uber's argument is for creating jobs, or at least income. Right? But there's no bones about that. They're trying to develop a robot car too.
Well, if you could retrofit an existing car, you can say, look, I'll drive my car to work and back, and then at night, I'm going to rent it out to Uber and put this wireless steering wheel into it, and it can be working all night for me, and I can be in bed asleep.
And one of the questions I asked in last week in London was, so my brother-in-law drives with a dash cam, and the dash cam just records whatever happening, but it has a lane change sensor. So if he's changing lanes a little too fast, it beeps, which means there's intelligence to it. And so the question I was asking was, okay, what happens if you get the first homebrew robotic car? How are you going to deal with that? And then again, the whole fleet control, right? So a few months ago, I don't know if you saw this video of a Cherokee Jeep that someone had taken control of. It wasn't self-driving, but they were able to take control through the radio or some sort of navigation system, and were able to control both starting and stopping and steering the thing. So Jeep had to pull back and recall its systems. So there's that question of what happens if these things get hacked?
Yeah, carjacking takes on a whole new.
And some of the robotic cars are designed to be more efficient on highways, to platoon, right? So they will drive very close to the next one because they can maintain distance really well. And it assumes that there's really good coordination between these things. But what if there's a glitch? So I think we're going to figure out how all of that, how we sort all of that in this decade.
I guess you solve that by at least having a human being in there to take control if things go wrong. I guess.
But then if you're, I try not to use cruise control, because when I go on cruise control, I tend to get sleepier. So imagine if you get used to the car driving, you'd fall asleep easily. Will it wake you up?
Nudge.
Like wake up.
All right, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you.